Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed legislation on Monday requiring high school students in his state to learn about the victims of communism. Let's watch.
Today, I am signing HB 395, which will officially designate November 7th as Victims of Communism Day to honor the more than 100 million people who have fallen victim to communist regimes across the world.
Here with us to discuss is political reporter for The Hill, Julia Manchester, and policy director at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Good morning.
So I'll start with you, Rachel. I'm curious if you see there being any kind of conflict between what is generally a conservative belief that there should be a separation between, government and what happens at schools, that communities should be able to dictate their own curriculum, and what seem like these edicts that are coming down from the governor's mansion that are trying to get CRT out of schools, and now this move to teach what can only be described as a kind of anti-communism, pro-capitalism message.
So I think that there's a distortion of how some people look at sort of modern day conservatism, which is this bright line between government and local communities, and the two, shall never meet. When in reality, I think, conservatism, if you sort of study the philosophy, has always sort of recognized preserving tradition, preserving traditional values. And I think, where necessary, Ron DeSantis sees his role as stepping in and saying, where, choices are extreme at the margins, where you're going to say, no, you cannot do that in our state. I don't necessarily put sort of the Victims of Communism Day in that bucket. I think that's pretty standard fare. I know here in DC, we have a big Victims of Communism gala every year. So I don't know that that necessarily crosses the barrier, but I do think Ron DeSantis generally, to your point, represents a sort of new right, new conservatism for the modern era way of approaching governance.
Yeah, Julia, does this show that Ron DeSantis really is, becoming this very, very national leader of the new right and of the Republican Party, that he, I think regardless of how you feel about this, is a sign that he has a very intuitive grasp of the right battles to pick and, what is pleasing to the new coalition on the right on issues for which school curriculum issues are so important.
Yeah, well, it certainly shows that he's positioning himself as that figure, but I think we need to look at where this is all taking place. Florida, the center of the Republican universe right now. And I will also add that Florida is home to many immigrants and people who are descendants of immigrants who come from former communist regimes, whether that's Cuba, Venezuela, some Central American countries. So this is very much Ron DeSantis, very much trying to appeal to that population, as well as talking about, like you said, Robbie, curriculum and school issues. He's sort of marrying them in this address, in this proclamation that he's giving. But yes, it shows that he is very much positioning himself as this national Republican conservative leader. And I think that really all started with the pandemic and how he handled the pandemic. So it's interesting to watch Florida, though, because you obviously have Ron DeSantis in Tallahassee and former President Trump down in Mar-a-Lago. So we'll see how that dynamic plays out between these two men.
Yeah, and Rachel, I want to follow up with you. I think a little bit similarly to Brianna, in that while I probably, like you, have an equal disdain for communism, and I would want it to be taught in schools, in history classes, about the significant body count. I think that's probably there are a lot of cases where it's not the evils of that political system are not shown to the extent that the evils of fascism and Nazism are, and also actually just the teaching of later 20th century history is not always very good because they run out of time in the school year. So, but all that aside, it feels a little, there is some kind of hypocrisy, I think, that's hard to get around when at the same time saying, no, the schools may not teach, these ideas around CRT, which are kind of ill-defined, and many of the most extreme ones I don't think should be taught, but because the idea is not very well defined, can kind of encapsulate probably some things that are perfectly
of race
benign,
or any flaws in our capitalist country.
or just beloved appearing in the the school library or something like that. Do you see what do you understand what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I think I tend to look at this less as sort of curriculum control and more, as Julia pointed out, as a political positioning statement, to be totally honest. I mean, let's not forget, Florida's home to a ton of Cuban refugees. And those Cuban refugees have very specific feelings about, communism as a form of government. And we know that plays a very significant role in Florida's political dynamic. So I think there's a little bit of that going on. I don't know how the sort of Victims of Communism Day language, executive order is structured, if it's structured in a binding way that forces schools to do this. I somehow doubt it. But, I do think he's simply saying, look, this is something, that is important for students to understand around the world. And it is true that system of government has led to more death and destruction than I think any other. So to the extent that it's, highlighted or at least touched on, probably not the worst thing in the world. But I don't think it's, as far as I can tell anyway, it's not necessarily a cudgel that's being wielded against publicly funded schools. Like, you have to teach this. And that would be true, I think, more of the CRT debate.
Well, Rachel, let me ask you this. Something that is being suppressed in the context of the CRT debate is a conversation about, slavery and what some people describe as an American original sin. I know that a lot of people reject that language, and I understand the reasons why. But between 10 and 12 million African human beings were brought across to the Americas in the transatlantic slave trade by very decidedly capitalist governments. Is that part of the curriculum? This is a situation where the date for National, Communism Victim Day is a day that will live in infamy. It's November 7th, and it seems interesting to time it to the day that is so significant in the context of World War II, when of course was the Soviet Union that had the largest casualty count and ending that war with 20 million approximated people dying. And is the context of the arguable successes of various communist regimes and the demerits of various capitalist regimes being taken into account here? How do you assess who is a victim of capitalism in a world where, yes, America has the world's largest prison population by population, and absolutely with 2 million people in jail? How are we tallying what constitutes a victim of capitalism versus a victim of communism?
I think when you talk to most teachers about this, I think it gets into a distinction between being self-critical and self-reflective, and then straight out saying, well, the United States is an evil country on par with the Soviet Union, on par with Venezuela, Cuba, whatever. And I think that's what a lot of people reject. I think the point you're making, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is the ability to be self-critical about our own system is important in an education system, right? You want to teach people to think critically, not only about other countries, but about the system in which they live, to be able to, inform their own opinion about it, which, later informs how they approach our system of governance on the world. So I don't think that is in particular an issue. It's just usually a matter of emphasis, in my experience anyway, a matter of emphasis in how it's framed. And that's what people reject about the teaching of critical race theory, is that in so many cases, it's being taught as, you are evil because of your immutable characteristics. You can never recover from the color of your skin, and America is, irrevocably stained because of the sin of slavery, that, we are never able to overcome it.
I also don't think, I don't want to start a whole argument here, but slavery and capitalism are as closely necessarily linked as communism and political repression.
How?
Because there are lots of capitalist countries that don't have slavery. Slavery certainly has existed under capitalism, but it is not a necessary condition for capitalism,
I would
whereas
argue
political
that
repression is very much in communism's DNA.
The buying and selling of human beings, I would argue, is capitalism. I would argue that the insurance companies, many of some which persisted today, like Aetna, that made their money insuring the lives of slaves for their slave owners, meaning if a slave dies, Aetna got started paying money out to slave owners.
There was slavery before. There was slavery before capitalism.
In the United States
today.
of America, the richest city in the country used to be in Mississippi because it was the seat of American riches in slavery. The most millionaires per capita were in Mississippi because that was the seat of slavery. And what CRT attempts to teach is not that whiteness is an original sin and an immutable characteristic and an evil. Quite to the contrary, the whole point is to paint a broader, more fulsome picture of where America came from so people can understand the relationship between capitalism and some of the ills that have come in this country, just like there are failures in political systems all across the world, communism not being unique in that respect.
I'm not saying they're not related and that slavery has not been part of America specifically, but we got to give Julia the last word.
I'm just the national political reporter here. Look, I mean, at the end of the day, like I said, the debate aside, this is Ron DeSantis posturing himself and positioning himself. We can talk about the ideological implications of this all day long, but I think at the end of the day, when we look at Ron DeSantis' strategy, his reason for this is because he supposedly wants to run for president. He has a big re-election year coming up this year. He wants to position Florida as, once again, the center of the Republican universe. I think that's what it really ultimately boils down to.
Yes, indeed. And I'm getting more and more interested for what a head-to-head Trump-DeSantis matchup would look like. We'll see if that takes place. Julia, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.